Welcome to another episode of the Untangling Web3 podcast. Today, we are very excited to be joined by Cynthia Huang, the co-founder and CEO of Dtravel, a Web3-powered vacation rental ecosystem. An experienced entrepreneur with a strong tech and crypto background, she previously co-founded Altcoin Fantasy, a crypto trading simulation game with over 350,000 users. Cynthia will be bringing a wealth of experience to our conversation today on Web3 tourism and travel. Cynthia, welcome to the show.
Hey Alec, hey Jack, thanks for having me. Super excited.
Hey Cynthia, thanks so much for joining us. We wanted to have you on the show for a long time now. How are you doing today, first and foremost?
Really good. Probably not as hot as you guys. It sounds like you guys are getting a heat wave in London.
You can see the
Yeah,
sweat
we're,
signs for those watching at home, I think.
we're really struggling. You know, when it goes over about 21 degrees in the UK, everything grinds to a halt, and we're at over 30 today. So yeah, it's pretty tough, but we're gonna struggle on manfully. So yeah, let's kick things off then. So as Alex said, your expertise and your kind of positioning in the Web3 world is around tourism and travel, right? And we really want to dig into that. But first of all, just to situate us in this world, can you explain to us how important is tourism and travel in general? If we're just thinking from a Web2 old world perspective, why is it so important?
I think there's a practical sort of economic answer, and then there's the philosophical answer, and I'll answer both. And I love this question because there's I'm both a practical person, but also a little bit of an idealist. So I think this really speaks to what I like to think about. On the practical side, tourism and travel obviously make up a large portion of GDP worldwide, especially in small countries where they don't have a lot of natural resources. Tourism makes up a pretty big percentage of their GDP. So I live in Portugal, for example, and in Portugal, I think the GDP that comes from tourism is about 20% or so, which is pretty high for a small country. And so you can imagine for a lot of countries, it's the way that they can start to build wealth, start to get money into their countries. And so there's a very practical reason why tourism and travel is very good for the ecosystem worldwide. On the more philosophical side, I think that there's something very beautiful about travel, which is you get to go and see how other people live. I think when we grow up, we live in these bubbles where we don't really know how other people live. We think the way that we live is how everybody lives. We think that the way that we think, the things that we eat, how we spend our day, the types of friends and family that we have is the same everywhere. And you start to grow up and you're like, oh, actually, that's not the case at all. And people live so differently. So when you travel, you get to see a glimpse into that. And not only is that good for you because you acquire knowledge and you learn how to think about the world differently, but you start to look at how you can apply this thinking to your own life. And a lot of times that might be better, right? We think that the
Mm.
way that we learn how to do things is the end all be all, but that's not really the case. And then secondly, I think it builds a lot of empathy because we have these personal connections. And so if you meet somebody face to face and you're like, oh, this person is a person just like me, they have the same desires, wants, dreams, they're funny, they're really warm and generous. Now those barriers, I think, between people start to decay. And so you can't look at people as this other, but you just think of them as people just like yourselves. And I think we need a lot more of that. This is obviously getting very philosophical now, but I think the world could definitely do with a lot more of that connectivity, right? Because we are starting to live in this world that feels very divided, but I think travel is one of the solutions that can really bring people together.
I love that so much. Like you're so right. I mean, we often say, me and Jack, that this should be a philosophy podcast because Web3 kind
Yes.
of borders on philosophy meets technology or practicality, as you kind of said there. So it's so important to kind of discuss these things. And it is Web3 that often kind of puts, philosophy on the forefront of, how do we do things and why are we doing things more importantly. But you're right. Like we say, it's an increasingly globalized world, but it seems like there's also increasing hate and like kind of fear of the unknown. I think so much hate comes from fear of the unknown. Like you say, tourism is such a good way to kind of experience someone's culture and help understand that unknown. So like we say, travel tourism is so important. I think it's one of the stats I saw was like it employs 1 in 10 people in the world or something ridiculous like that. So it's huge numbers. We originally actually had I think a friend of yours, Sam Simmons, on the show, and he talked about
Yes.
the shared travel experience. And he was like, you have to speak to Cynthia. She is so knowledgeable about all this stuff. So that's the reason we
Oh,
got you
so
on, because we
sweet
got
of
so
her.
excited. But he kind of touched on some of the, the problems with Web2 tourism and travel. But, you're very like familiar with this space. You've got a lot of insights to this space. What are some of the problems that you see with Web2 tourism and travel right now?
again, I think this is sort of a multi-layered answer because from the consumer perspective, there's a set of problems. And then on the supply side, so, travel providers, I think there's a different set of problems. And there's even a set of problems as it relates to countries or cities that are experiencing tourism as well. So I think on the consumer side, one thing that we're starting to see is very high costs. So obviously after COVID, everybody wants to travel, but flights are getting pretty expensive, especially seasonal travel. So if you ever travel anywhere in Europe, I mean, you guys know because you're in the UK, but like travel in summer in Europe is insane. It's so crazy. I
Mm.
was looking at a trip to Venice and it was 400 euros a night for like something that's, like a 1 star, and I'm like, "This is crazy," it's just not affordable. So I think there's a lot of costs, and then the experience hasn't really changed. Like, I think since e-commerce became a thing and you could go and book travel on online travel agencies, that was the last sort of, like, big technological advancement we had, but since then, we haven't really seen a lot of progress in terms of improving the consumer experience because you go on and whether it was sort of like the 90s or now, it's still very much the same. You're searching for your destination, you put in your dates, and then you book
Mhm.
something, but it doesn't feel very personalized. And
Mm.
there's no integrated travel journey either because if you're booking on Expedia or Airbnb.com or somewhere else, like it doesn't remember or know anything about you. And so you're always starting from scratch. Even if you're searching on Expedia, for example, like it doesn't really remember anything about your past searches and your preferences. You're starting over again every single time. And
Mhm.
so that's why I think AI is going to be a huge game changer for this because of how it can really personalize that experience. And then really quickly touching on the company side, I think as we start to build more and more infrastructure and there's a lot more layers of connectivity and integrations, that starts to get really tangled in like a bigger and bigger web because we're dealing with a lot of legacy infrastructure and just I think integrations and APIs just complicate things and that ends up costing a lot for the end consumer as well because now you
Mm.
have these layers of intermediaries, layers of infrastructure that at every layer they're adding additional cost and it's the end consumer that ends up bearing that. And then
Mm.
finally on the tourism side, I'm sure you guys have probably heard of this, but so many places, especially in Europe, I think, are experiencing over tourism, and it's
Mm.
become a really, really big problem where people are protesting and, you know, kind of going back to what we said earlier about the beauty of travel. I think there's definitely a danger that that might go away because we're
Mm.
not handling travel in a responsible manner.
Yeah, there's so many interesting points to touch on there, right? And I'm glad you brought into the conversation this idea of over tourism because it's something I think we see to some degree in London. You know, both Alec and I based in London. You get these hotspots that are just completely packed from time to time, and it's actually not that nice if you're kind of a local living and working in the area. And then as you mentioned, you know, in Spain we're seeing all these protests now. It's becoming a
Mhm.
much bigger problem. You know, Paris Olympics is going on as we're recording this. I'm sure there's going to be challenges there too. But then you also mentioned this whole idea of how many touch points you have when just trying to book a journey, right? It's this idea of so many intermediaries involved, presumably increasing costs in different places. I mean, when I try and book a holiday, and you often get told to try and book direct with someone,
Mhm.
like a hotel or something, but then you find, you know, it's either much cheaper on a different website or it's listed differently on different websites, and it becomes really confusing, right? So at the center of that, you mentioned connection as a principle, and I've seen you talk about the idea of the interconnected trip. So is that part of how you see a future vision of travel, and what exactly do you mean by interconnected trips?
Yeah, so I think that's the ideal that we in the travel industry have been working towards and trying to accomplish. And the interconnected trip, I think, means something slightly different to different people in the industry. The way that I see it is that it basically is like this end to end experience that's personalized for you. So, regardless of how you start your journey, if you're searching for flights or a hotel or even an experience that you want to book, it doesn't really matter where you're coming in, but it's going to remember like no matter where you start, it will have your travel preferences or your booking preferences built into that. So the idea is that you have all of the data for all of your trips that you've booked. So if you're let's say if you travel somewhere by yourself, maybe you have certain preferences when you're a solo traveler versus if you're traveling with your family or a partner or for work, you might have, again, different preferences. And so you almost have like these profiles that you can switch on and off. And when you go to book anything, it's going to remember those preferences and automatically filter and only surface things that are super relevant for you. And I think this is where AI comes in, because AI is really, really good at obviously looking for a lot of data and being able to make those recommendations. And I think where the Web3 aspect comes in is Web3 is amazing at storing a lot of interoperable data. And that's one of the challenges that we've had on delivering in this interconnected trip, is that every company is very siloed, right? That's sort of a feature or bug
Mm.
of Web 2. And I think they like to keep it that way, where they have their own data. They're not sharing with anybody else. If they're ever sharing their API, it's permissioned access. And so it's basically impossible to deliver on this idea of an interconnected trip, just because every company operates on its own. And so Airbnb is not going to be sharing data with Expedia. Expedia is not going to be sharing data with um, Uber. And so
Mm.
you as a consumer can never have that end-to-end trip that's connected with all of your preferences for that very reason. But in Web3, one of the things that we talk about a lot is this idea of interoperable data, where if anybody has data within one ecosystem, now that data can be interoperable. It uses the same data standards, but also, more importantly, you as the consumer can choose who you want to share that data with. So if you were like, hey, I really want this end-to-end experience, you can say, I'm going to share it with Uber, I'm going to share it with Airbnb, I'm going to share it with Dtravel, I'm going to share it with Expedia. And then everybody has access to your data to really be able to build that like custom profile, but then you can revoke it at any time.
That's a really interesting point. And you kind of covered so many issues with like the Web2 travel system, like quite quickly. You kind of touched on the term like Web3 tourism. I'm sure we're going to go into like a lot of detail on what that actually means. And it's something that like you mentioned a bit earlier, which I think has a lot of kind of resonance with blockchain and Web3 overall, is the idea of we have this over tourism, right? We have these central hubs in the middle that everyone goes to, like the London, the Venices, the New Yorks. And what we want to do is push more and more to the edge outside of these hubs. And I think that, I mean, Jack says this all the time. The whole point of Bitcoin was to try and push transactions to the edge and have a more peer-to-peer interaction without going through these central intermediaries everywhere. So I kind of think there's a perfect kind of resonance there between the two ideas. But one thing that I kind of want to double click on is you were talking about, okay, blockchain technology helps with the interoperability of all these data silos in the ecosystem right now. How does that actually work? Like, why is that the case? Why do these companies kind of need blockchain underneath to actually kind of facilitate that opening up of their data silos?
Well, I think on the infrastructure level, like, so what they're using today in Web 2 are their own databases, right?
Mm.
So they own their own databases, whether that's like a physical one or whether it's on the cloud, versus on blockchains. It's open and permissionless, so anybody can write and read data to the blockchain. And more importantly, everybody who writes data to the blockchain is using the same standards to write that data. Whereas in Web 2, if let's say, for example, Expedia has an API, even if they were allowing somebody else to connect to it, company 2 has to basically map all the data fields of how they've interpreted that data from their own database to Expedia. Versus if you're reading blockchain data, which is not easy either, at least all of the data is stored the same way. And so it's just a lot easier to be able to read that data and to be able to consume it.
Do you think that then a lot of the data in this kind of this paradigm will need to be stored directly on chain, or do you think it'd be like off chain with some like on chain referencing and that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so I'm not a huge fan of storing a lot of information on chain. I'm not sure that it's necessary. Also, I just think about like, when you're a teenager, for example, and you do something really cringy and looking back, you're like, oh God, what was I thinking? Or you wore something really horrendous. I mean, would you want that stored on chain? Probably not. And so I think a lot of this is the same way, where right now we've started with storing a lot of data on chain just because that's the tools that we have.
Mm,
But what I'm really excited to see, and I've seen some companies start to do this, is reference the storage on chain, but all the data storage it happens off chain. And
mhm.
what I think what we are missing that we really need is with IPFS and Filecoin, like, I think they're great solutions, but what they're missing is the ability to be able to delete things, or for the user to really own their data. Because once you store a
Mm,
copy of that data, it's there forever, and you cannot force the nodes to be able to delete, which goes against GDPR requirements, actually. And
mhm,
so I think the way that we solve this is if you have some sort of infrastructure layer that puts the user first, where they can encrypt the data, they can choose who they want to share with, and then they can recall that data or revoke access at any time. And then there's something where it'll automatically delete the data without the nodes having to opt in. So I don't
mm,
know technically how that would work, but that's sort of the vision that I have.
Mm. I really love that. I think I'm glad we're talking about the data side of things first, because I'm also a big proponent of using the blockchain for as a data storage and availability layer. I think there are plenty of good use cases for it. But as you say, you always need to think about what are the implications for each given use case from a GDPR standpoint, from a right to be forgotten, deletion, etc., as you said. And yeah, I've
Exactly.
always had that same question about IPFS, right? If it's just being distributed amongst different people, then how do you manage to completely? It's like getting off the web, right? It's pretty much impossible. So yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, and I think that's one component of how we definitely discussed with Sam about using the blockchain as a source of data for open data standards, and we can get more into how exactly you're doing that later. I think another is on the digital asset side. Again, Sam talked a lot about issuing kind of digital collectibles that are linked to your travel. A third one that we didn't really talk about with Sam that I think is kind of maybe much more up your street and that you're very interested in is around Dows and how they can be used
Mm.
in a Web3 tourism setting. So first of all, because we haven't covered it in huge detail on the show, could you just give our listeners a very brief intro to what is a decentralized autonomous organization, a DAO, and why are they relevant to this Web3 tourism vision you're talking about?
Yeah, so DAOs were really popular, I think, in 2022. Have kind of fallen a little bit out of popularity, but I think as a structure is still very interesting and important. So I like to describe DAOs as kind of like a collective or a co-op model, but with a little bit of a Web3 element thrown in. And so there's sort of two distinguishing factors about DAOs versus co-ops, for example. One is that there is a wallet, like a Web3 wallet at the center of it. So that's where the funds go, and everybody collectively decides on how those funds are spent. And then the second thing is usually some sort of rewards or incentive where everybody gets a share in the benefit of the DAO. And what was really interesting is there was a Web3 and travel conference last year in Barcelona that I attended. It's put on by the Trips community, and Luca is sort of heading that initiative. There's another one in Umbria, Italy in September this year, which and they're
all the
having
best
an expo.
destinations as you'd
Yeah,
expect.
yeah, it's like um, an amazing castle that they're having it in, so I definitely recommend if anybody wants to learn more about Web3 and travel, definitely hit up the conference. But what was really interesting last year is they brought on a speaker from the Catalonia Tourism Board, and this person was talking about how they could potentially use DAOs to solve the problem of over tourism. And I think how I've always seen the potential of DAOs and how it solves over tourism specifically is like you guys were talking about. There's all these like hot spots that everybody likes to go to, but I don't think that it's necessarily because they're just the best places or that people only want to go to those places. I think it's a discoverability problem because there's so
Mm,
many amazing, amazing places all around the world, like little known villages, towns, etc. And people just aren't aware of it because, there's like no place for it on Google. You don't hear about it. But if, let's say, for example, everybody in a small town decides to form a DAO around tourism and promoting tourism, well, they can leverage the power of everybody in this DAO to do things like creating social media content, going to their friends and family, or like even, posting on Reddit, like basically really putting together a collective effort to get the city or town out there and start to get more known. And then they can work with tourism boards or um, destination management companies to get like funding or grants so that if they are bringing people in, maybe they can spend more on marketing and have a bigger budget to be able to do things
mm,
like this. But to me, I think it's primarily a discoverability problem that over tourism is sort of like the symptom of, because I guess like social media partly is to blame too,
mm,
because everybody sees these cool photos and then they want to go there. But I think there's also something to be said about the human need for being the ones to find something new and cool and interesting. I think
Mm,
that can play into the Dow model because if you could say, oh, like, discover this really cool thing and you'll be the first one to get there and like take a photo and be able to discover it. I think people would love that idea. And maybe there's some sort of benefit they get from the Dow. Like you can get a free dinner at one of the restaurants
yeah.
in the city, or, there's like so much potential for this. And I think if tourism boards are open to trying something like this, then it makes it feel like everybody in the city or town or place has
Mm.
some sort of not incentive, but like they have a shared benefit for coming together to do that. Versus if one company is doing it, it feels very much like they're the only ones benefiting from it.
Yeah, and then I guess like traditionally we kind of have this very top-down model. The money comes from the top, and then people have to bid
Mhm.
and get approval, all this kind of stuff. It's one person or one company that kind of organizing everything, that's passing it down. But like the whole point of a DAO is to have this kind of decentralized organization, what a village is, like you kind of described there, where everyone's contributing, seeing where the assets are going, seeing where the money's going, seeing where the benefits are being reaped. So it completely makes sense, and that's such a cool idea and quite ambitious for people, councils or whatever it is you just mentioned, to be thinking about this already. But I can't help but keep seeing like the resemblance between what you're talking about, the idea of these central hubs taking like all of the kind of the throughput and all the activity, to the kind of the detriment of these smaller, maybe more beautiful or more actually kind of tourist potential places on the outskirts that just don't have this discoverability. And I think like this really aligns very well with Bitcoin, blockchain, all these things, the idea of having kind of peer-to-peer recommendations as well. Something
Mhm.
we talked about with Sam is like right now the kind of the whole Web2 model and social media and all this kind of stuff is so centralized, not just in terms of the companies running the data and the adverts and all this kind of stuff, but also the individuals. There's only so many actual content creators on an Instagram, and it kind of benefits them because they have all the traffic, and that kind of self-propagates all the traffic. So they recommend one small village in Italy, that's now the number one spot in Italy to go to instantly. Whereas the model you're kind of talking about is much kind of more decentralized, smaller, individual, and like that. I just love the idea of that, because I'm
Mhm.
constantly trying to work out where to go, but it's always the top 10 places on everyone's list that always comes up when I Google it. It's so
Yep.
exciting.
Yeah, exactly. Like I was just in Tokyo and I wanted to eat ramen. So of course I looked up Google and there's like 5 in the area, right? But everyone that you go to has an hour long lineup. And there was this one that we ended up going to that didn't have a lineup at all. And it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy where
Mm,
if a restaurant gets attention, it just continues to grow. Whereas there's a lot of other restaurants that are equally as good, but for whatever reason, people haven't really picked it. And
yeah,
then it ends up actually like watering down the experience because they get so busy. So you have a bad experience. Your standards are a lot higher now that you've been waiting in line for an hour. And so I just
yeah.
think it's not a healthy way. But I'm kind of curious because like you guys live in London and it doesn't sound like you said sometimes it's annoying, but I feel like people in London don't really mind as much unless it's winter. Then they've like turned into terrible, mean people that you shouldn't talk to.
I think like my opinion is kind of London's so big that I don't see tourists where I live. I live at
Mhm.
15 minutes from all the tourist hotspots. So I don't experience any tourists in my day to day. I cycle, so I don't really get the tube. But when you're in the city center, I kind of like it. Because I don't know, I like the idea of people coming to seeing like culture and wanting to experience like some of our way of life, even though, I wouldn't say that, Westminster Abbey and all these kind of things are our way of life. Like I certainly don't live in those kind of places, but I'm pro tourism. Obviously, I know how good it is for London. So why would you be anti
Well, I can answer that question for you, Alec. No, I'm
it?
kidding. Well, but I definitely, yeah, I see both sides of it because I think, especially the economy we have in the UK, it's actually really important. The tourism sector, I think it's hugely important. You look at how many people just come to the UK because of the royal family and to London to see the sites related to the history around everything to do with the royal family. But then, I see it in the smaller things, like if you go somewhere like Oxford Circus around Christmas time because you want to just you just want to go to a shop or something. It is unbelievable. It's impossible to walk around. It's genuinely horrible as an experience. So I think there are definitely peak times when you really feel it. But yeah, in general, I think people are pretty used to it who live in London now.
Yeah.
Mhm. Well, I was just curious, like, what's the difference between because London's always been a super popular tourist destination. So why don't people protest in London? Whereas like in Barcelona, it's become not just in Barcelona, but many cities in Spain are really protesting, are very angry about it. So I'm just kind of curious, like, where does that come from?
It's not in our culture, I'd say. British people don't protest. Like, I think it's quite
We
weird.
just
We're like,
complain.
we just complain, like we kind of just bite, but bite our lip and kind of tut and things like that. We don't really protest. I don't think it's a big issue. Like, I have a lot of friends, like international friends, that come to the UK, and then I was like, I'm gonna go to London. I'm like, guys, do not go to London. Go to Edinburgh. Go to Bristol. Go to Liverpool. Like, these are such beautiful kind of off the grid, well, not off the grid, but unknown places for international people. Like, you don't want to go to London. That's not the real British experience. All these other
Mm,
cities, kind of like what you're talking about here, like in terms of over tourism, that's like the real UK experience where you'll meet real British people that have real like culture that's actually interesting and different and only found in the UK. But yeah, I kind of don't really think about it in kind of terms of the UK when we think about over tourism, but it's obviously rife here as well. Now, we've spoken a fair bit about Web3, tourism, over tourism, problems, opportunities. It's time to talk about Dtravel, your company, the CEO and co-founder of. Give us the 30-second elevator pitch. What is Dtravel? What's its mission? How does it fit into all of these potential opportunities that we've been speaking about in Web3 travel?
So Dtravel is a peer-to-peer decentralized vacation rental ecosystem, and we are deliberate in calling it an ecosystem because it's made up of not just a suite of products, but also very importantly the people within the ecosystem who have different roles. And some people like to think of us as a Web3 Airbnb because I think that's like a very easy comparison, but I think that definitely does leave out a lot of really important factors, which is that when we think about peer-to-peer in Web2, I think that just means like it's a marketplace. But for us in Dtravel, when we think about peer to peer, it really means that the interaction is directly between the operator or the host and the guest, that the payment is directly between the host and the guest, and then all of the ecosystem rewards are shared between all the people who participate within the ecosystem. And sort of the mission for Dtravel is direct peer-to-peer connections and ownership. So those two things are really important to us. And I think part of this is like coming out of my background. So I've been a vacation rental operator for over a decade. I still have properties that I run. And more importantly, I've been a community builder in sort of the Airbnb ecosystem for that entire time as well. When I started as a host in 2014, it was very, very new. Nobody really knew what hosting was about. Everybody still thought it was super weird that you would let a stranger to stay at your place. And so there just weren't really a lot of resources available. Like if you Googled Airbnb at the time, you would only see like horror stories like, oh, guest trash, like 40,000 in damages. And so as a new host, you're like, oh, do I really want to do this? Like, what do I even do?
Yeah.
And so I ended up co-founding a forum bringing together Airbnb hosts all around the world. And I think it was just the right time for it because it kind of grew into the largest forum. Again, I still run it today. So I've been a really passionate community builder in that space, like really drank the Kool-Aid from Airbnb very early on. My dream was to work at Airbnb because I really love their mission and vision. And I still give them a lot of credit for this movement that they started because I think it's really important, which is this idea of connecting personally and being able to live like a local. But I think just because of the nature of them becoming a public company, they've had to optimize for other things, which I think makes sense. And every sort of Web2 company goes through that. But for us, because we are Web3 and decentralized, we're trying to do that differently, where anybody who comes into our ecosystem will be able to get ownership via the TRVL rewards. And it's not just about us saying we're going to do XYZ, but it's really meant to be a community effort where people can participate and start to drive decisions through the governance process.
Yeah, I really like that you talk about Airbnb there and the fact that you're taking this peer-to-peer approach because I won't trot out the whole Airbnb origin story because I feel like everyone knows it now, but it was like the most peer-to-peer thing you could do. You were literally finding someone to put an airbed on their bed for you that you could stay in. So it was very personal, right? And direct to a
Mm-hmm.
relationship between the host and the person staying. And I love that you're building that up kind of from the ground upwards, basically from the protocol level almost. And so how it all works then, I've seen you have your own protocol, is that right? You have the night protocol, and then you also have the TRVL or travel token. Now, how do those two things relate? So I understand that one part might be more towards data, one part towards governance, but I'm not totally clear. So yeah, could you explain how they work together?
So there's, yeah, I think a few different pieces to our ecosystem. The first that we built out is called Dtravel Direct. So that's a website builder where a host could create their own direct booking website and then be able to send that to a guest so that the booking would be peer to peer, and then they could diversify away from other platforms. Because what happened during COVID, and I think this is a bit of a catalyst for the industry, is there were mass cancellations because of all the travel restrictions. But then if you were a host where, you were relying on Airbnb for 90% of your business, all of a sudden you still have all these expenses that you have to pay, but you lose 90% or even 100% of your business overnight.
Mm.
And I think that realization made a lot of hosts feel like they need to start diversifying and thinking about ways that they could own the customer relationship. And so have like direct bookings. But and I think you talked about this earlier, Jack. Like direct bookings has been something that really started in the hotel industry, and I think that's what they're really trying to push. And that has really started to grow in vacation rentals as well, where every year we see the percentage of direct bookings grow. I think it started around like 15% a few years ago, and now it's gone up to almost 30%. So more and more hosts are realizing that they need to move away and start to book direct, but they need tools to do that. And so that's what the website builder is for. And that product didn't have a search component. So every individual host had their own booking site and they were responsible for driving their own traffic and demand and bookings. But we just launched a search product, which is aimed at travelers, so that now you can search all the properties that are powered by Dtravel, and you can search for things like which listings accept crypto. So very excited about that product, which we just launched recently and should help operators with bookings. And then the other piece, which is like the big long-term vision that we're driving towards, you mentioned this, is the protocol. So the protocol is a data layer where we're storing and referencing data, and we're also reading that data. But what we're trying to build out is everybody within the vacation rental industry using that protocol as well. Because what happens is, and we went through this, so this is part of why we decided to build this. Every time we want to connect to another company, we have to get access to their API. Most of the time it's not open, meaning that we need permission to access. We need a commercial term in place to be able to do that. And then we have to spend time building out the integration. But every integration is non-standard because the data fields of how you reference data within vacation rentals is not standard. So we might call something a listing, somebody else will call it a property. And every time we build an integration, we have to spend time basically translating our data field to their data field. And so you can imagine how much time and effort goes into building out integrations, which is crazy because data generally in vacation rentals should be pretty standard, right? Like you're not going to have a big difference in house, apartment, etc. And so
Yeah,
there's
I'm
really
very
no,
surprised to hear it isn't.
yeah. And so there's no excuse, I think, for the vacation rental industry, which is pretty new, to have these problems. And so with the data, with the Night protocol that we're building out, the idea is to have a standardized data standard that people would um, all adopt. So it makes it much easier to be able to read and write data. And then all vacation rental data is just sort of referenced within the protocol. And that also makes it more efficient because instead of everybody storing their own data, you just have sort of this like decentralized hub for data that anybody can decide to read or write from. And then you would just pay for either access to consume that data, or you can monetize your data by offering for other people to consume.
Yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense. As I said, like it's mind blowing to me that there isn't a standard for this stuff already. But I guess maybe the fact that things are evolving to a different model of rental from hotels to Airbnbs, maybe that does have some element of play in here because we are the market is changing. So for that protocol, the protocol essentially defines the rules and the data standard that is being
Mhm.
exchanged, and then is that where you see the role of a DAO-like structure being used to help the protocol evolve? Like, how is the governance going to work for that in the future to accommodate maybe new changes to the industry?
Yeah, so this will definitely be a long-term thing that we still have to kind of figure out as we go along. But right now, the intention is very much that it's an industry-driven initiative. So we don't want to be the ones that own the protocol. That's why it needs to be decentralized because I think one of the challenges that we've seen across the board, and I talked about this at the beginning, is that every company always wants to have their own standard and every company always wants to have their own data. But when you have that, there's an incentive for that company to be the ones to own everything, right? But if you
Mm,
have a decentralized model where nobody owns it, but everybody benefits, that's really the only solution to be able to fix some of these problems. And so if you have a DAO model where anybody who's contributing within the ecosystem, whether they're accessing data, consuming data, providing data, et cetera, or contributing in other ways by building on top of it. And so they get a right to vote, then everybody will be incentivized to hopefully vote for whatever is best for the protocol and for the industry in general.
yeah, I think it often blows my mind how much it costs to do this kind of API integration in the traditional Web2 model. And like, I remember like theoretically, academic, like 5 years ago, be like, oh, Web3 is obvious, standards are obvious. That's the easy way. Everyone should do it. Here's the three high level benefits of this. And you go into a room with people and you say, oh, actually, this is going to cost millions to do because it's going to take so long. And they're like, obviously, we're not going to do this because like it's such like ambitious, future thinking, high level, abstract stuff to say in 5 years' time you might reap the benefits. So it's really positive to know that you guys are doing it from now, and it's like actually going to reap the benefits, hopefully as soon as possible, because the industries need this, and it's not even like between industries, and especially when you're talking like cross border and all this kind of stuff as well. Like it's so
Mm-hmm.
beneficial to have this kind of enriched data pool where everyone can contribute to get the best models available. Yeah, so it's fascinating, really, really cool. I think you talked a little bit about what the benefits of Dtravel are to renters. You talked a little bit about sovereignty, the fact that with the Airbnb model, people were say, losing everything over COVID, losing all the bookings, but still having to pay this fee. So there was this opportunity for more peer-to-peer and direct. How is the platform affecting the users, the actual bookers of the system, and also communities? We talked about this problem with over tourism and all this kind of stuff, but how is the platform working on those two kind of fronts right now as well?
So for users, we kind of separate them into hosts and guests. On the host side, the three problems we're trying to solve are payments, cost, and then ownership. So on payments, because we are not an intermediary, then there's never any payment issues. Because what happened last year, for example, with booking.com is that for over 6 months, they had payment issues and couldn't actually pay hosts. So,
Mhm.
you can imagine being an operator, you have
Mhm.
expenses, you have a mortgage, staff, et cetera, and you aren't getting any revenue for 6 months. I mean, that's a
Mhm.
big, big problem.
Mhm.
And so because of how we've built out the infrastructure, we can never be in the middle of a payment. So with crypto payments, it's instant settlement that goes automatically to the operator's wallet. With the
Mhm.
fiat payments, we use Stripe, but again, we're not ever touching those funds. We take our commission off of it, and then the rest goes directly to the operator. And then the other really nice thing too, especially speaking as an operator, is that whenever the cancellation period ends, you get those funds immediately.
Mhm.
Whereas if you're using a platform as an operator, I don't think a lot of people know this, but let's say that Alec, you booked with me and you're booked a year in advance. I don't
Mhm.
actually get those funds until the day that you check in.
Mhm. Wow.
Wow.
So there's a big, big delay in between
Mhm.
when you book versus when I get that money. And that's actually how a lot of companies basically arbitrage and make money because they're holding on to those funds. Imagine, even if they're only earning something like 1 to 3%, when you're
Mhm.
talking about hundreds of millions of dollars,
Mhm.
that's huge.
Yeah, damn. That's crazy.
Yeah, and so from a payment perspective, like, it should be the operator that gets that money immediately because they're the ones who have an asset that they're paying for, right?
Mhm.
Like, why should we benefit from it? And, like, as the guest, you've already paid that money thinking that that's gonna go to the operator, and so it's really, like, democratizing, I think, access to those funds, and you can decide what you want to do with them at that point. The second is around fees. So, it's obviously gotten very expensive to book vacation rentals. That was how
Mhm.
it got really big, was that you saved a lot of money compared to hotels, but we're seeing that start to switch back because of how crazy the fees are. And again, I think partly that's the platforms charging, anywhere from 20 to 30%, but also the layers of connectivity that at each level they're adding additional 10 to 20%. And really importantly is like the ownership piece with
Mhm.
a lot of these platforms, not just in travel, but I think like any platform that you contribute to and that you use, you don't get ownership. but you obviously contribute a lot to the growth of that network because you're an integral part of it. And so for us, what we want to do is, if you're contributing to growth by using it, or by providing a listing, et cetera, or even being a community member, you should participate in that growth. And so all of our incentives are aligned versus, I'm making money and you're not making any money from it. And so it becomes oppositional.
I understand. That's so cool. So like you've given us the as is of the company right now. What are like some of the, you talked about a lot of problems early on as well, especially on the kind of the over tourism piece and what's happening kind of more generally with the big picture stuff. What are some of like the upcoming features and like expansions that you're thinking of to tackle some of those problems, or really like push the boundary in the next few years?
One thing that we're working towards, and I'm like really, really excited about this because I think it really fits well within our vision, but I think is a pretty innovative approach to some of these problems, is open sourcing some of the products that we have. So with Dtravel Direct, the website builder, we want to make that available so anybody can actually build on Dtravel Direct, because if it's up to us to constantly build features, we will have a never-ending roadmap for the rest of our life and beyond that. And it's like not only not scalable, but I think it's doesn't really lead to the best user experiences, because we can think of things for sure, no problem. But I think if you let the community in and they can build things that they feel are most useful and they make that available to anybody, then I think that really develops a very, very rich ecosystem. So we're working on figuring out how we can like basically modularize all of our products so that people can just build different components or plugins on top. If they want to monetize it, they can, or they can offer it for free to anybody in the community. So just really making it like very, very open source and community run.
Yeah, it's a really interesting and a very Web3 idea, I think, the fact that you are open sourcing these things, making it public, not only almost to keep you accountable, but then to get that community input. We talk a lot about this with gaming and the fact that we see it with various game engines being open source to a degree, so people can start building their own games to improve the ecosystem. And yeah, you're right. Like, it's your end users and your customers potentially that will come up with even better things to add to that ecosystem, to that network. So I think the network effects of that are really important. We also just, as we come to the year, I want to look towards the future in general. So not just for Dtravel, but you mentioned AI as one of the exciting prospects for things like recommendations. Is that the emerging technology outside of Web3 that you're most excited about for benefiting this vision of tourism? Or is there anything else on the horizon? We've got quantum computing, AI, IoT, all these other things happening. Is there anything you're particularly excited about for the industry that can help you guys?
Definitely AI. And I think it's the combination of both AI and Web3 that's sort of the secret sauce, because AI on its own will always need data. And that's what blockchains can really provide, especially when you think about community source data. If everybody is providing their data and their incentives are aligned to be able to provide that data, and then they can now start to train the model to say, oh, this is like good or bad. That's much, much more powerful than just an AI or a company working on an AI sort of, again, in a silo, right? When you have a community trained model, it's more diverse and I think a lot faster. And this is where the personalization piece that I talked about, where you can have data on a blockchain related to travel that anybody can start to get training on. And you can, let's say, build out your own personal AI assistant that's like a travel recommendation. I think that is something I'm really, really looking forward to. I think that's like super exciting.
Yeah, I can't believe I never thought about that. But yeah, like a virtual travel agent, right? The fact that we don't tend to typically, or most people, I think, don't tend to use under a certain age a travel agent anymore. But an AI based one is exactly the kind of thing I probably would use and often would need when I'm on the web looking for my next holiday. So yeah, I think that's an exciting prospect.
Well,
So
Jack, I'll just
Cynthia,
solve the problem for you. You're just going to Tenerife every year for 1 week on a resort beach. That's it, with cocktails. It'd be quite an easy
well,
problem to solve for you.
I need an AI generated travel agent to expand my horizons then, right? I need someone who can think. If I can, maybe that's the kind of thing I would do. I'd say, take me somewhere I've never been before and do it as cheaply as possible. That would be what I'd yes. Yeah.
But then you have to actually accept it and go. That's the hard part.
Yeah. Yeah, when the money leaves my account, that's
back
when
to Tenerife, please.
No, But enough about my personal preferences. Cynthia, it's been such a great episode. Thank you so much for joining us. We just like to end every episode with two kind of standard questions that we ask everyone. We like to see, the different variety of answers. So, no pressure on these, but if you're ready, we'll go ahead and ask you both of these. So the
Yes.
first one is, in one sentence, what is Web3 to you?
Web3 is really about, again, like the philosophical side of it. So it's about democratizing access, not just to opportunities, but also to finances, because I think we're shifting into a world where people want more equality. And so that's really what Web3 solves for, is the ability for people to take ownership back and be able to do whatever they want with that access. Because like if we think about somebody in a developing country who's never had access to a bank account, now all of a sudden they can take crypto and lend it out to somebody, make some money, and start to lift themselves and their family out of poverty or start to build a better future. And I think that promise is why most people are attracted to Web3, which is like that very idealistic piece. And so for me, Web3 is not really about the technology, but about the potential future that it can enable.
Yeah, that's a great answer. The best answers are always the ones that touch on philosophy. So I'm glad you did there. And I think it's the first time someone's explicitly mentioned equality in their answer, which maybe is surprising actually, but I think it's a really good point to highlight there. Okay, and then the second and final question then is, so if you could pick anyone on the planet today from throughout history, or maybe they're even a fictional character, to sit down, have a meal, and discuss Web3 with, who would that be and why?
Oh, see, you said Web3. If it was not Web3, my answer would probably be very different. But since it's Web3, I actually have been thinking about this a lot, but I would love to go back to either the development of the internet or maybe sort of like the .com era, because we always talk about how we're sort of in the, I don't know, 1990s of the internet, right? And to talk to somebody who's lived through that, I think would be really interesting and would help us validate whether all the struggles that we're going through in Web3 today are just sort of like a symptom and maybe like even a necessity of a technological change. Because probably around that time, we had the same reactions where people were like, oh, that's a scam, or, there probably were scams because it was just so easy to throw up a website in the 90s and, trick people out of their money. But like, I feel like people have very short-term memories where they forget
Yeah.
about the pain of these things, and so it feels very new. It's like, oh, Web3 or crypto is like a scam, and these problems are just inherent to crypto. But I have a theory that it's actually inherent to every technological advancement or sort of like industrial revolution, and we just have forgotten, or maybe those people just aren't around anymore to remind us of
Yeah.
sort of the pain points of this.
What's the phrase? Those that don't know the history are tasked to
Doomed to
repeat it or
repeat it.
something like that. Are doomed to repeat it. That's the one. Yeah. So Tim Berners-Lee, that's the one of the founding fathers of the internet. Right. We've had that answer a couple of times. He's actually an absolute hero of Jack's. So it's a great answer and one we've had a couple of times before. We'll have to try and get him on the podcast. Maybe I think it
Oh
would
my
make a lot of
gosh,
people's
yes.
dreams come true. What is you've got to tell us now? What is your your non-Web3 answer for having a guest at a dinner party?
Oh my God, there are so many. I mean, because you also said fictional, right? And I'm like a huge, huge reader. So I can pick like a million people who I would love to
Go on, you got to
have
give us one. You give us
here.
your top one of all the fictional, all the any potential anyone's.
Oh, I mean, okay, this is, I guess in keeping with the theme, like Ada Lovelace would be super cool.
Nice. Okay,
Yeah,
nice.
cool.
That's a good one. We might like try and chop that to your Web3 answer as well, just
I-
to put it in there. No, we won't. That's a great answer. We should probably ask that question more often because it's actually quite insightful as to who someone
Yeah,
actually is, right?
exactly. Yeah, yeah. And actually, one question that my husband's asked me before, which I really liked, is what person, and it could be fictional or non-fictional, do you sort of like most resonate or see yourself as?
Paul Atreides, tragic hero.
I think Winnie the Pooh, maybe. I think,
Very, very
Wow.
wise. Very wise.
yeah. It's interesting,
never
honey.
have
Just
picked
living his best life. Doesn't engage in anything else. He just
Isn't
likes
that
to
what
chill
we
a
all
lot.
aspire to?
Yeah, I think so. Oh God, this has been such a great episode. Thank you, Cynthia. I've learned so much about Web3 tourism, and also a lot of philosophy as well. We always love when we get to talk about philosophy on this podcast. But no, thank you for joining us, and thank you to those listening wherever you may be. And join us next time to untangle a little more of Web3. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Untangling Web3.
Don't forget to send us your thoughts, questions, and comments on social media, and be sure to follow us on your favourite podcast provider to catch the next episode. See you next time to untangle a little bit more of Web3.
The views we express here are our own and do not reflect the views of our employers.